no regrets, no confusion. There'll be no pollution. I'm so thankful I've decided to change my ways.
Welcome back to the Leaving Eden podcast. It's Gavi here. Sadie is not with me today. I recorded this episode a couple weeks ago when Sadie was off dealing with some family stuff. Today's episode, I'm talking to Chad Harris. You know him from Shiny Happy People. You also know him from TikTok. He goes by ArchRadish85 on TikTok. Chad Harris is an IFB, an IBLP survivor, and he grew up as a missionary, and so we have a great conversation about what it is like to grow up as an IFB and an IBLP missionary. I hope that you guys enjoy it. I found it really interesting. We discussed topics like the racism that is pervasive within the missions board that he was under. We discussed topics about, just how difficult it is to grow up in that life as a child. I hope that you guys really enjoy it. But before we get into that, the Leaving Eden podcast is the podcast mostly about my BFF and co-host, cult expert, cult survivor, Sadie Carpenter, her life in and escape from the independent fundamental Baptist cult, the cult in which she was raised. We talk about this cult, we talk about other cults, we talk about religion, we talk about fundamentalism, we talk about the real and present threat that cults and cult ideologies pose to society as a whole, and it is our goal to promote freedom of mind, freedom of thought, and freedom of religion. So if you like our show, if you are a fan of our show, then you can do some things to support us. You can join our Patreon, patreon.com/Leaving Eden podcast. You can join our subreddit and our Facebook group. Those are both called Eden Exodus. So you go in the search bar, search Eden Exodus, and you will find our subreddit and our Patreon there. Good times. And that's a great place to have discussion. You can also, we have merch available. We're going to have our t-shirt design for the Revelation series that we're doing right now come out pretty soon. So that should be fun. And I'm excited for that. And I think other than that, I just got to thank the patrons now. So I gave it all to your patrons. Your names are I'm Not 1010, Kathleen Moncrief, Melissa Mosley, Melora King, and Todd Dale on behalf of his lovely deconstructorine ex of a spouse, Madeline Antrim. Thank you guys so much for supporting us at the I Gave It All tier. I truly cannot explain what it means to get that kind of support. Our Faith Promise Missions tier patrons, your names are Alex P., Allie Allen, Autumn of Our Discontent, Brittany, Chrissa Walker, Dora J., Eleanor Donahue, Hannah Ross, Hannah Montana, Hope Norum, Horton, Here's a Shane, Janine Collin, Jana Connor, Jen Kaharski, Jessica Tambo, Jonna, Junie B. Jones, and the B stands for Bible Humper, Kat Henwood, Kay Terwee, Kristen Marie, Linda Morgan, Madeline Antrim, Madeline Cusick, Maddie the Seventh Day Bad Adventist, Marlena Stuve, Mary Martin, Megan Arndt, Morgan, Rob the Methodist, Stephanie Johnson, Steve and Amy, Susie, Tara McNamara, and as always, Wes the Cowboy. Thank you guys so much for subscribing at the Faith Promise Missions tier of our Patreon. We do appreciate you oh so much. And without, I guess, further ado, I'm going to get into my conversation that I had with Chad. I hope that you guys enjoyed as much as I did.
Hi, I'm Tracy.
And I'm Sharon. And we are Feet of Clay, Confessions of the Cult Sisters. So way back in the 1970s, we became radical Christians in the Jesus movement.
We were promoted to leadership in the crazy cult commune Last Days Ministries, founded by none other than Christian music megastar Keith Green.
Now we're sharing our decades-long escape from the trauma and abuse of extreme Christianity.
We tell our own stories and also invite guests to talk about fundamentalism, purity culture, arranged marriages, child abuse, misogyny, homophobia, power-hungry patriarchy, and much more.
Much, much more. So join us as we share our journey of healing and humor and how we finally found peace and joy on the other side.
Feet of Clay, Confessions of the Cult Sisters, wherever you get your podcasts.
Welcome, Chad Harris, a.k.a. Archradish. You know him from Shiny Happy People and from TikTok. How are you doing today, Chad?
I'm doing awesome, Gavi, and I got to say, I am pumped to be here. Thank you so much for having me on today.
Well, it's my pleasure and the pleasure of all of our listeners to have you on this show, especially, last time we had you on, it was for the Bethany Beals husband Dave situation. That was, he's an atheist now. And I said, this is our atheism correspondent. And there was somebody in the comments was like, who do they have as their atheism correspondent? And they looked you up and they're like, okay, I approve. So,
I mean, honestly, it's a tall order. I was just like, I hope I'm representing okay. Like, I've never been asked to represent atheism as a concept before, so that's actually that was a great experience. And I got to say, 10 out of 10 would do again with you guys. So I appreciate that.
It's amazing to have you back here representing the views and beliefs of 100% of all atheists of all time ever.
Well, the American Atheist Convention at the time of this recording was actually about a week and a half ago. And from everyone I've talked to who was able to attend, I wasn't able to go. But from everyone I was able to talk to, like, everybody agreed with each other 100% of the time. And there was absolutely no controversy about anything ever and no arguments. That is a complete lie. There were several. But hey, what can you do?
Atheists don't get into arguments with anybody, especially not each other.
No, of course not. Like, yeah. Yeah, especially not on Reddit either. Like, that never happens.
No, that's I remember it must have been like 10 years ago, the R atheism blow up that happened then. That was wild. I remember hearing about that.
It was euphoric, really, when you think about it.
Oh my God. Some people have no idea what we're talking about, but some people who do, that's for you. Chad was nice enough to come on to this show and talk to us about life as a missionary kid.
A lot of people know me from having been part of the Institute in Basic Life Principles, or IBLP, which has been discussed on the show many times, and which pretty much everyone who listens to this podcast has probably seen Shiny Happy People at this point. But another half of my life that I haven't really talked about as often is being an independent fundamental Baptist missionary kid. I was, in fact, a missionary kid from the age of 12 to the age of 19. I spent my teenage years over in Europe. My folks were missionaries to the Netherlands and Belgium. And so we had that going on top of the whole ATI thing. So as far as, the Independent Fundamental Baptist Church goes, that was also very much part of my life, but from a slightly different perspective than I've heard talked about quite a bit, because life as an IFB missionary, you get to see a lot of different churches, and you get to see, like, in hindsight, some of the overall systemic problems, but from a different perspective, in that when you're stateside, you're in a different church every week, pretty much trying to raise money. And then when you're over on the mission field, you have to deal with those churches and have to be, at least on the surface, accountable for how you're spending the money that they're giving you. So it's an odd world to be in, and it's kind of a fishbowl. And I do want to say from the outset that my personal view on this going forward is that this is not a time in my life that I'm very proud of. I didn't have much of a choice in the matter, obviously, but I've since come to realize that missionary work, as it's practiced in the IFB and in most mainstream evangelicalism, has a lot of roots in colonialism and has a lot of roots in, trying to intrude and implement a particular kind of belief on a particular people, which has led to all sorts of issues throughout history. And way smarter people than me on the subject have spoken about that. But I have come to realize that the proselytization part of evangelism overseas is problematic in a lot of ways. And honestly, it was not a great experience for me. It was one of the things I really had to deconstruct because it was such a large part of my life. My entire teenage years were spent in this world. And I just thought I'd share with folks who may have not have heard just how life was for IFB missionary kids, because I haven't heard of too many who have really spoken out since coming off the field and deconstructing in their own right. So I was hoping to give that to your folks today.
So you're in the Netherlands and Belgium. What age was this? How old were you at the time?
Well, we started on the mission trail when I was 12, and we were either stateside raising money or overseas in the Netherlands and Belgium from the time I was 12 to the time I was 19. So pretty much my entire teenage years, which is how I ended up not going to any of the Bill Gothard training centers or headquarters because, ironically enough, living overseas, it was too expensive to send me back to the States to work for Bill Gothard. So I was spared a lot of the
Wow.
issues that a lot of my peers in IBLP did for that reason. But I did spend my teen years over there. I was still homeschooled under IBLP and ATI as a high schooler, quote unquote. And yeah, that's pretty much from the years 1997 till 2004, I believe.
Wow. That's man. So you're in the Netherlands and Belgium. From what I've heard, being an IFB missionary the take rate isn't very high. I have to wonder, in the Netherlands and Belgium, was that successful? Was that not successful? What does that look like?
Oh, absolutely not successful. I mean, okay, so first of all, let's take a 20,000 foot view here. If you're going to be a missionary, you could pick way less comfortable countries and two of the most affluent countries in the world that are historically Christian. Okay. Like it's a little silly and absurd that we went there in the first place. My dad, for whatever reason, had, even before I was born, had this real desire to go over to Europe and particularly the Netherlands because he heard there were so few missionaries over there. And he thought it was like fertile ground to go start churches. Okay. And that just didn't happen.
That's kind of harebrained.
It was, and it didn't work the first time when he was over there. He did start like an English speaking work. He was really wanting to do like a Dutch speaking work, learn the language and everything. He ended up doing an English speaking church, planting one there in the city of Eindhoven, the Netherlands. And this was in the late 70s, early 80s. He started losing his hearing about 82 or so, and figured that he couldn't learn a language while his hearing was going, so he went to England to work with the military there as a preacher. That's where I was born, and then came back to the States soon after that. But he decided in the mid-90s, after his hearing loss subsided, to try one more time, and he ended up being even less successful somehow on that trip. So it was not great because, aside from being culturally Christian, the Netherlands and Belgium, the Dutch-speaking areas of Belgium, they're very, very much skeptical as a whole. Pretty much everyone identifies as Christian, but there's very few practicing folks, even less so as the years go on. It's just more of a cultural, this is like our country's heritage, so we'll show up once or twice a year, and that's that. It's not really a part of a lot of people's daily lives over there, as it used to be.
So like church on Christmas and Easter.
Pretty much.
And did he ever say that like he felt like a calling from God to go there, like a very specific calling to go to these countries, or was it just like a interest that he had?
Oh, he said that he felt a distinct calling. The way he would talk about it was, at the time he received the calling the first time, he was pastoring a church in Phoenix City, Alabama, and he was cleaning the church, and he was listening to a missionary from the Philippines who was dying of cancer and crying about all the people that he hadn't reached with the gospel, like entire cities. So he was like, well, what is the least missionaried country in Europe? Because he really wanted to go to Europe for some reason. And so I think it was partly because, he didn't want to go anywhere that was like, had hardship and everything. He had kids and all that. So he did find out that there was really only one missionary to speak of, at least that leading that side of Independent Fundamental Baptist over in the Netherlands. So he started by going to the Netherlands and trying to start church planting there. And then the Netherlands kicked my family out because they wanted to homeschool and not have my older three siblings go into the public school system there.
Really?
And in the Netherlands, you can't do that. So they moved across the border to Belgium in the Dutch-speaking areas there, up in the northern half, because in Belgium, you just had to prove that your kids were learning. Didn't matter where they were doing it at.
Yeah, so it could be ATI booklets.
Yeah. It was convoluted as hell.
Man, I know. It's just the more like I've been talking to Sadie for like 4 years about this, and her story is just like everything that she tells me is just like, who thought of this? This is so harebrained. And then, you know, talking to you, you have a different story, but it's equally as harebrained, but just in completely different ways.
Yeah, it's and I mean, and even the way, because, you know, Independent Fundamental Baptists, as you're very much aware, they don't have a central denomination, they don't have a convention, they don't have a central governing authority. So you're pretty much at the mercy of all the other churches working together to send you overseas, because no one church is really going to send you as a full-time missionary. And in most countries, you can't, especially in Europe, you can't really go over there and work because, you know, you'd have to apply for a special visa for it, and that's the whole thing. So my dad, the way we did it was we went from church to church, mostly on the East Coast, and everywhere from Alabama to Michigan to Virginia to, I think there were a couple of churches in Pennsylvania that supported us. We would go out on the road. I would take all my homeschooling material and sit in the back of our 80s Buick station wagon with the backwards facing seat. And I would do my schoolwork as we went around to all these different churches up and down the East Coast. And my dad had the same sermon that he would preach every church we went to, trying to lay out our work and his alleged burden to go over there and present the gospel to the Netherlands and Belgium. He had a slideshow that he would show at many churches, and we're talking old school carousel. I know. Film slides and everything, that stuff that he had taken in the 70s to try to, you know, convince folks in the 90s to go ahead and send us back over. It was a whole presentation, and it got to the point where I could just about preach Dad's sermon for him, if it ever came down to it.
Do you remember any parts of it?
Oh yeah, let's see. He would always talk about how, you know, the Dutch have a saying, God made the world, the Dutch made Holland, because most of the Netherlands is under sea level, and they've reclaimed it all. They've reclaimed the land, you know, with the dikes and pumping all the water out through windmills and hydroelectric pumps. But, you know, we know better because, you know, God made, you know, that entire land, amen. And, you know, they've completely rejected him and, you know, used that as something of a selfish stand to say that, you know, this is what they did, when we really know who's behind it. We're going to turn them back to God. Amen. You know, stuff like that. He would talk about odd things like some of the foods that they would eat over there, like raw herring, which actually was quite good. I'm not going to lie. And he would talk about, you know, the people. He would talk about both the Netherlands and Belgium being dark countries full of atheism, that you could cut the spiritual oppression with a knife. They did something over there called Carnival, where they would parade in the streets and just do all kinds of sin and debauchery and drugs in front of everyone. And it was just essentially you know, the whole Mardi Gras thing that we did over here. He just made it sound so much worse. So he would, you know, weave these stories, because my dad, if nothing else, you know, he wasn't a very successful preacher, but he could spin a good yarn. He would have people on the edge of their seats, and more often than not, we would get support from a church. But IFB churches don't really support missions like individually unless you have a huge church to a great extent. So most of our churches would support us, you know, no more than $15, $30 a month. It was rare that we would get a church that would do over 50. So we had to go to a lot of churches to get a monthly income.
That doesn't sound like a lot.
It's not.
And I mean, if you're an IBLP family, you're going to have how many kids? How many siblings do you have?
Well, I'm the fourth of six, but we kind of lucked out on that a little bit.
Okay, so that's small for an IBLP family.
Well, we didn't get into IBLP until I was about 7. We got into it a bit later. I was born 10 years after my older brother, who's the next one up. My parents very much let me know that was not planned, and they let me know that pretty much every day. The younger two siblings didn't come until after my folks discovered the Quiverfold movement through my mom's OBGYN, who was part of the Quiverfold movement and eventually got us into IBLP.
That's a lot of information right there.
I know. It's a convoluted story.
this OBGYN, man, I guess like if you're really into babies, if you're just like most babies is the most good, like I guess that makes sense for having that career and also that religious bent. But that's what, so what you're going around to all of these different churches. And so something that Sadie has talked about in the past is being a pastor's kid and the immense levels of pressure that were on her at all times to be behaved perfectly, or her dad would, possibly lose his job, lose, the support of the church people, or if somebody was going to come and maybe give them a bunch of money and they saw the kids were misbehaved, then maybe they would decide not. And that could be the difference between them, being successful and being not successful. Did you have that same sort of pressure if you were as a missionary kid?
Absolutely. But multiply that by the number of churches we visited, and you can see how it exponentially got worse, because every week we were in a different church pretty much. And Dad had to do recon, as it were, because this was before the internet was ubiquitous as it is, and most churches were not online at all. Dad would call up preachers, and he would have long talks with them, just one-on-one at first, and try to get a feel for what the church that we were visiting was like. And sometimes he would have a chance to speak with the pastor alone before he met the rest of the family. Other times we would show up at a church and the pastor would want to take the entire family out to eat, which seems like a nice gesture, but you have to understand that was, to us as kids, we understood that we were being evaluated, because Dad would tell us before we visited each church, now this church is like this. So, like, for example, some churches really did not like the IBLP. So we would have to keep it very quiet that we followed Bill Gothard's homeschooling program. Some churches had a bus ministry where they would give out toys, and I knew that Dad had, preached against, having to use gimmicks to get kids to come to church before. So we would have to keep that part quiet. Don't ever mention that. My loud mouth one time did so at a church that did it. So that had to be added to the list. Certain churches had a Christian school, and we couldn't really make too big of a deal of the fact that we were homeschooled. Some churches were very strict about having a television at all. And we had one that we had a VCR hooked up to where we would watch pre-approved movies. So we had to keep that part very quiet as well. So we had to adjust our behavior to every single church we went to, because that could mean the difference of whether or not that church would take us on for support. Now, if it was one service or maybe two services on a Sunday, that was easier to do than, say, if we were at a missions conference where we were expected to attend for the entire week. The church would have, special nights every night where they would have a different missionary come up, but all the missionaries had to be there throughout the conference. So it was a lot. You learn how to very quickly adapt to what was expected of you. At least you tried, but at the end of the day, you were a kid. So, you weren't always that successful.
Just having to try to adapt to whatever it is this church wants to see just because you need to get something out of it. That's got to really mess with your sense of morality as a child.
Very much so, but I didn't realize that until I deconstructed later, because to us, it was just what you did. We were already used to the fact, before my dad went to the mission field when I was 12, we were already used to the fact that he pastored a church. And, much like Sadie, we were told that, we were always being watched. And if Dad couldn't keep his household under control, then he might as well quit and work at Walmart. He always threatened specifically working at Walmart as if that was like the worst thing you could possibly do for some reason. But
I mean, it's not, they don't pay that great. They don't treat their employees that, or at least they didn't during that time. I don't know how it is now. There were a lot of documentaries about it. Yeah.
Oh yeah, there are a lot of problems with how they treat their workers, no question. But I think for him it was more of a classism thing. Like it was, he would have to step down from this lofty height of being a preacher of a church with 30 people in it to, working a menial job, which the fact, he was bivocational. He would work as a maintenance man and other things while he pastored. So it was really no different than what he was doing, just added stress. The point is, though, we were told that our family's livelihood on some level was dependent on us as preachers' kids. And then it got doubled and tripled the pressure when we went out on the road. And when you're being told that, the fact that your family may or may not eat that month depended on, how well you behaved, well, you made at least a little bit more of an effort. And the trade-off is later on you develop a complex where you feel like you're always being evaluated and criticized for everything you do.
I mean, that's got to just give you the worst anxiety attacks ever.
Yes.
That's so crazy to just think that I guess that's sort of how they preach that God's always watching, though, is that you're always being evaluated. But the thing is that it just changes everywhere you go. The thing that is that you're being evaluated on and the criteria that they're using, that's got to just, I mean, does that just like turn you into a people pleaser?
100%.
Really?
You nailed it.
Man.
Because one thing I learned very quickly was, in order to, get the money, we had to be the kind of missionaries that they wanted to see. Now, once we got over on the field, we could do pretty much whatever we wanted, just as long as we checked in via letters that we would send every other month. But as far as, being able to get that initial push to actually go to the mission field, you had to really perform. And it instilled in me this idea that, compliance was what was the first duty of being in the IFB. And that would, much later when I actually did work for an IFB church, I was taught that, the policies of where you're at, even if you don't quite agree with them, that's the policies and you better abide by them or else. It wasn't until I saw the leadership just absolutely blatantly not following what they were making other people follow was when I started questioning, what I was involved with.
Yeah, because it's the same story over and over and over again, where it's the little people at the bottom who have to actually live by all the rules and who are, working themselves to the bone to try to comply with every single rule, every single piece of everything. And then the people at the top just, they can do whatever they want and they don't have to actually deal with the consequences of their actions. There's no accountability. What percent of the time would you say you were over there in Europe versus when you were over in the States on, is it deputation, they call it?
Yeah, so deputation was when you initially go out and start raising the support to go overseas. And the way it was supposed to work in our particular mission, which was Maranatha Baptist Mission of Natchez, Mississippi, which is no longer there. The way it worked was you were supposed to raise enough money to be overseas for 4 years, and then you would come back on furlough and check in person with your supporting churches for a year, and then go back over and do another 4-year stint overseas. We ended up not doing that for various reasons. We took about a year and a half in 1996 and 1997 to raise support, and then in December of 97 we went overseas, and we came back in December of 1999 for an abbreviated furlough. It was supposed to be about 4 months. It ended up being longer because my dad had cancer and had to have surgery for that. But after that, we went back for another 2-year stint. So we would break up our furloughs into smaller chunks and go overseas for smaller chunks as well. But roughly, it was about every 2 years we would get a few months reprieve to come back to the States and check in with churches. So I would say about 75% of the time that we were missionaries was spent in Belgium proper.
And so when you're coming back, you're trying to say, okay, this is the good work that we've done over in the Netherlands, over in Belgium, and just trying to prove to people that their investment is not going to waste.
Pretty much. And also, if need be, raise some extra support because, inflation marches on and the cost of living keeps going up. So you might have to try to convince another few churches to take you on. So it was constantly a game of trying to keep, the individual churches happy enough to where they would support you. And there were some churches that, were very strict about what they expected from their missionaries. And understandably so. If you're giving someone money, you want to make sure that it's being used wisely. Although giving an IFB missionary money now I question, the efficacy of anything you're doing. But, right, if you're giving someone money, they should be accountable to report what they're doing with it, no matter what it is, especially if you're donating of your own free will. So we would get some very interesting demands that would sometimes change. Like one pastor required all missionaries to send monthly updates as to what they were doing instead of bi-monthly, which is what our mission required. And Dad told him that the administrative burden of that, because it was just our family who, did the mail merge and put together all that, was just too much for one church. And that pastor dropped our support. So that was like $30 a month we never saw again. So, so it was always a game of, trying to keep everybody in the States as happy as possible while trying to do the work that you were tasking yourself to do overseas. And it just got to be a lot,
Like, so what does the church look like when you're over in Europe? Is it just like a home church? Is it like, do you have an actual building? How many people are coming? What's going on there?
So the way our mission worked, Maranatha, they did something called the Indigenous Church Principle. Not every IFB mission did this, but ours is pretty famous for doing it. The idea would be that you would help start a church by holding Bible studies in the homes of the nationals there in the country you're at. And then they would provide the funds and the means and the organization to start, holding their own formal church services. The idea that our mission put forth was that no money from the States should go to building a church overseas. That needs to be handled in the country you're at, which kind of takes the edge off the whole colonization thing a little bit. But unfortunately, as you probably noticed from the information I sent you, it wasn't from a benevolent place. It was more or less from a place of American superiority and, frankly, racism that they didn't want American money to go overseas for that reason. But the idea would be that you would start with a Bible study. You get a group of people together. They say, "Hey, we want to start a church." They find a building to hold a church in. Then eventually they would have their own place. Then you would train a pastor to take over, and you would move on and do it in another city in the same area you were at. That was what our mission required our missionaries to do. Not everyone was successful at it, and we certainly were not, because we had a hard time getting people to want to do a Bible study in the first place. We had a couple of families that mom and dad knew from way back in the 70s and 80s that were interested, but they weren't interested in really pushing it forward from there. And so dad got pretty frustrated that, no one was wanting to have a proper church. The reason that our mission did that was they claimed that the Apostle Paul did that in the book of Acts, and therefore that's the only prescribed way to do missionary work, period. If you're not doing it like that, you're doing it wrong. And this led to a lot of frustration with a lot of missionaries that found out that things don't really work like they did back in the Roman times, No,
but I can also kind of see it from if you're going to romanticize this, I can kind of see it like if you're thinking about like during frontier times. That, we have a settlement. Oh, well, they're going to send out a missionary, and the people from the town have taken up a collection to build a church building. Wow. Manifest destiny.
Yeah.
You mentioned a manual, a missionary's manual, a online PDF that you sent me. I'm going to why don't we go to break, and then we will come back and we will discuss what is in the manual that you sent me.
Certainly.
Okay.
Hey, Sadie here. If this is your first time listening to the Leaving Eden podcast, make sure you go back and check out episode 57. It's a primer episode for new listeners. That episode tells my personal story and gives you all the terms and information that you'll need to know going forward. Also, check out our cult true crime series, The First Family of Fundamentalism, so that you can get the whole cult story. If you like our show, you can support us by joining our Patreon, where we have extended and uncensored episodes as well as other bonus content available. You can also join in the discussion in our Facebook group. That group is called Eden Exodus. Tell a friend, tell a family member, tell your worst enemy. The Leaving Eden podcast is a fully independent podcast, and we really appreciate your support. Now, back to the show.
We are back from our break. I am here with Chad, aka Arch Radish. You know him from Shiny Happy People. You know him from TikTok, from going to Not Church, Unchurch. What is it that you on Sunday mornings? It's Not Church.
Sunday morning Not Church on TikTok.
Yeah. If you want to go hang out with Chad, you can find him there. He has sent me the Maranatha Baptist Mission Purposes, Precepts, Policies, and Practices. 4 Ps. PPPP.
Alliteration is everything in IFB.
It's all either like alliteration or it's an acronym for something.
Mm-hmm.
Chad sent me this. I guess it's like a manual, right? It's like ideas, how you're supposed to act, how you're supposed to behave when you're a missionary, what morals are. And I was like looking through this, and there's a lot of stuff, just like they have a statement of faith where it's like the Bible is the word of God, Father, Son, Holy Spirit, 3 co-equal parts, that blah 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 blah, image of God. And then I scroll down, and then there's part where it talks about I will be disqualified if I am in an interracial marriage.
Yes.
So do you want to talk about this book? Do you want to talk about that section?
Oh, absolutely. So
yeah.
So the purposes, policies, precepts, and other P's of Maranatha were basically the law. This was written by a man named James Crumpton, who was the pastor of, I think at the time it was Westside Baptist Church in Natchez, and a ministry of that church was this mission, Maranatha Baptist Mission. And at one point, it was pretty popular in the IFB world for stances like, the indigenous church principle we discussed. And James Crumpton was also a rabid anti-Calvinist. He actually very famously preached a sermon called, "I am for the lily of the valley, but I'm against tulip theology."
That's a great Panic at the Disco song name.
Oh, yeah. That is actually, it would be. Pretty much like any cult leader. So he was very strict on what he expected out of his church members and eventually the missionaries that represented his mission. And a lot of times his personal beliefs would seep into the laws of the church and the mission he was running. And this very much, I think, exposes a huge prejudice in this man's heart, as well as those who work with him in this ministry. So this was a very solid rule that a lot of people who came to our mission that I talked to had an issue with, because at one point I was working for this mission and the church that ran it. Some people would see this and they'd be like, well, why is this here? And the answer I gave at that time was, oh, this has just always been the policy, so therefore it must be followed. This is a standard IFB answer, but no one and I never did get a good answer as to why it was done.
The old paths are the best paths.
Exactly. The old path is the best path. And again, keeping in mind, this is the same world that Bob Jones University exists and everything. This was not unusual. This kind of institutionalized racism was the norm at one point. And to give you an idea how much of the norm it is, Bob Jones rescinded their policy against interracial dating and marriage in 2000. This handbook was current as of 2015, which is the latest I've been able to find a copy. Yes, the latest I've been able to find a copy of these precepts.
That's the year I graduated from college. That's crazy.
So it's very much new.
Because here it says policies, well, be saved, be baptized, be a born again believer, accept our principles, and one of the rules is you have to agree to all the rules. Yeah, and it says belong to a local New Testament church, be authorized, commissioned, home church, attend all sessions of one of our institutes and missions, not have more than one living companion. This applies to both men and women, so no bigamy. And then number 7, it says not to be interracially married. Note that it is interracial, not international. It'd be fine if you married somebody over in the Netherlands as long as they were the same color as you. It says all races are acceptable as missionaries. Acceptable. That's good. If they meet other requirements, Webster defines the races as Caucasoid, Mongoloid, and Negroid. Mongoloid and Negroid are not words that I tend to read on a daily basis.
Yes, and you can see
they?
too just how how limited and how like blind this is to just the concept of race in general. It's just so racist. It kind of makes you double think.
Yeah, I mean, it's so racist that it's almost funny. Like how often do you see the word mongoloid in print?
But they're like, well, Webster's. But this is an appeal to Webster. Webster says it, therefore we're going to go with it.
The Webster's Dictionary of 1967 or something like that. Just
that particular dictionary.
Before the woke libs got in charge of the dictionary.
But this brings up also a really interesting point. They're appealing to Webster. You know what they're not appealing to? The Bible, the thing that they claim that they run by.
I mean, you'd think that they would have said, well, the Bible defines the races as the tribes of Shem, Ham, and Japheth. So
that's, come to think of it.
Yeah. So if you're a Hamite, then you can't.
I wouldn't be surprised if this were traced to that. Yeah.
It's so wild. It's I was reading through this. I'm like, okay, this is old school IFB. Yeah, I've read some, but then seeing, man, just it printed right out there. Just the it's not
the quiet part out loud. It really is.
I mean, it's not really quiet. This isn't some like diet racism. This is
full on, full blown.
This is some old school racism. This is like measuring people's skulls with with calipers level racism here. Wow. Ooh.
And I remember too, like when I worked for this mission, we did have a man of who was Asian, and he read this and he just noped right out of there. Like he was wanting to be a missionary. He was interested in going to the mission field. He was all on fire for this. He was fundamentalist. Then he read this and he was just like, "Are you kidding me?" And I was like, there are some things that need to be changed. He's like, yeah, but not fast enough. And he was out. And I don't blame him. Like, he really dodged a bullet on that one.
If somebody asks you about that and you're trying to get somebody to be a missionary, how do you even respond to that? How do you, I mean, you got to do some spinning. Like, you got to do some real PR work to defend that shit or to justify that shit. That's wild.
Well, the leaders of the church at the time claimed, oh, he was just interested in one of the girls in the church and everything, and that's why he took offense to it. I'm like, now I'm pretty sure he took offense to it because it literally, displays racism, it like institutionalizes it in this group. So it was awkward as all hell, but the people in charge did not see a problem with it, and yeah, it was.
The IFB isn't racist, people.
And I'm ashamed to say at that point in my life, it didn't really hit me until that moment. I was like, yeah, come to think of it, this is kind of up.
I mean, there's another part in here where they say there's no interracial adoption. You can't have interracial adoptions or something. That's, I mean...
Yes. So my folks, later on, when they left this mission and this mission eventually became defunct, they went to another mission called Fundamental Baptist Worldwide Mission in Memphis, which was started by someone who was affiliated with this group at one point. And their precepts are very much similar, except they did take out the interracial marriage portion and they changed the interracial adoption portion to say, we strongly discourage it and you have to check in with us before you do it. So yeah, it's the same thing, just with more flowery words. and this is true. This really goes to the heart of what IFB mission work was. I mean, it was white saviorism. Like they do say in here that all races are acceptable if they meet other requirements, but let's face it, they're essentially saying that they want white folks who are willing to go to these other countries and stuff.
Man, that. I mean, and how many stories have we heard of from, I mean, it must have been like maybe a year and a half ago, we had people who were missionaries write their stories in. And the situation that we kept hearing over and over and over again would be, they would go to these countries and think that they were going to be doing a great service to the people who were living in these countries. and they would go there and they would get there and they would be just so incapable of fending for themselves that all of the people who live there would basically have to take care of these random white people who showed up to try to save them.
Yep.
You're going there to save them, but really they save you, but not in the wholesome way. It's
not something that you do like a mid 90s, oh, everybody's the same kind of movie about. It's really embarrassing exposure of what the main problem is, which is, and two, like, even on top of the whole white saviorism and everything, there's also this, undercurrent that I believe was a part of the whole IFB missionary scheme, was that, people could just go overseas until certain things blew over. We had, for example, Dr. Bob Gray, who was and I'll have to look up real quick, Trinity. Yeah, his name was Bob Gray. He, in his 70s, he was the pastor of Trinity Baptist Church in Jacksonville, Florida. In his 70s, he decided to go overseas to Germany to work with the Roma people in Germany, along with another missionary who was already in that area. And the narrative that went around the IFB at the time was, oh, here's this great man of God who, decided at the peak of his career, when he was pastoring this large church that had this huge Christian college that a lot of people went to, he just decided to forsake all of it and go be a missionary on the mission field. Well, that worked until the first time he came back home on furlough, and the cops were waiting for him when he got to the airport. And
what'd he do?
Allegedly, he molested several young girls in his church throughout the years as a pastor. And we'll never know the outcome of that because he died while waiting for trial. But
wow.
But there were other legal actions taken against the church. I don't know the outcome of them, but they did. There were allegations that the church basically just sent him over there to lay low until the allegations blew over.
Like the in The Godfather, when he goes over to Italy after killing the guy.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, man, but it's wild to see churches literally being run by a cartel or run like a cartel.
Yes.
Like man, reading through this, the one thing that I guess you touched on earlier was the indigenous church principle.
But and I want to make it clear about the indigenous church principle too. Like, not every IFB mission board taught this, and this also led to like further encampment among IFB churches here stateside. So some IFB churches would only support missionaries of one particular mission board. I know that there were some missionaries that were sent out through a group called the Bible Baptist Fellowship, and any churches that were affiliated with that would, by and large, only support missionaries that came and were endorsed by the Bible Baptist Fellowship. I remember this because we would go to a church and Dad would find out all too late that that was the camp that church was in. He'd say, well, we're probably not going to get supported by this church. And sure enough, we weren't. And then, some churches just absolutely did not take missionaries from certain missions because of personal beefs or things, and not having to do with the missionary itself, but with the organization they were with. So, as has been made clear before, in addition to your usual IFB camps, like which school did your pastor go to, there were also, which mission board did your pastor support, which is why I've always called the IFB like a cult buffet. You could just choose whatever leaders you wanted to follow from a whole bunch of different camps, like be it the mission board that your church supported, or Bill Gothard, or or Jack Hiles, and the different colleges that your church threw support behind. Like, you had no shortage of different ways that you could support high controlling terrible ministries.
So I'm scrolling through this document, and here I see the appearance code. So you go to like what it is you are allowed to wear. The one time when they put the section for ladies in front of the section for men, the section for men is just like, dress like Christian gentlemen, dress neat, keep your hair short, well groomed, blah blah blah. Can't be long. Facial hair has got to be neatly trimmed if you have it at all. Don't wear shorts. blah blah blah. That's it. And then the ladies section is like 3 times as long, and it's like the Bible clearly teaches that women are to adorn themselves in modest apparel. Your Bible skip blah 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 blah. It's just like when to wear a dress that might be considered immodest. I mean, climbing a ladder, to paint a wall, playing basketball. Though we believe that. I'm like, wait, who here is playing basketball? Oh, here's the section on culottes. It says we believe that culottes are acceptable when made according to a certain pattern. We do not plan activities during our institute missions that would require culottes, so we request no culottes for our institute of like just so many rules. And it says be careful not to dress trendy or in mod styles, and it just makes me wonder, when did they write this?
Very likely, if I had to guess, it would have been somewhere around the 60s or 70s, and they never updated it.
It's got to be in the 60s.
Well, they never updated it except to apparently misspell modest. But, well, like you said, it is spelled modes.
I mean, if we're fans of biblical inerrancy, then that wasn't a typo. That was straight from the Word of God to this page right here. This mission's guide is inspired by the King James Bible, therefore it is inerrant.
You see, if you look at the original Greek that this policy was written in, you can see what the intent was. I'm kidding. I will say though that the church itself had a Christian school, which conveniently popped up right about the same time as integration in schools. But they had a Christian school, and they did participate in like local sports in the area. But any women who brought their kids who were wearing pants at all, like on the grounds for a home game, they would be turned away physically off the church and school property if they were wearing pants. They were told to go home and put on a dress. They wouldn't even let people from the outside world show up on their properties unless they were, dressed exactly to these standards. There are only 16 pages in the policies and precepts and what have you of Maranatha Baptist Mission, but it feels like you're reading a novel. There's just so much horrible in there, and so many ways that you could violate their precious rules that it's just a slog to read. So my sympathies to Gavi for putting him through that. Sorry.
But what's interesting to me about this is that these rules are so strict and so specific that
Yes.
So you would be going around to different churches, and I assume that your dad would say, well, we're doing Maranatha. Maranatha is our missions board.
Absolutely.
And would they know that's what that was, or was that information just not available publicly?
Absolutely. I mean, I think for the most part, most churches didn't care particularly about the racism. I mean, we are talking about churches that publicly supported Bob Jones University as well. So, they either knew about it and didn't care, or didn't know about it and didn't care, but it was never anything that came up. And of course, there's the whole inherent white privilege, within the IFB anyway. So that was, so I think that was a large part of it. And also, Maranatha at one point was relatively well known in IFB circles, particularly because of their founders' stance against Calvinism, which a lot of IFB churches were all about that. And also the fact that, that they knew that their funds were going to go specifically to church planting. So more than anything, I think a lot of churches, just saw that as they were good enough to get on with Maranatha, and they're pretty strict. So yeah, we'll go ahead and support them. A lot of churches also just didn't care. They supported missionaries from several different mission boards, and it just came down to how much they liked the missionary and the work that they were doing.
Yeah, and as long as you're getting people saved and baptized, and then it doesn't really matter if your missions board is super racist and doesn't allow interracial. I mean, man.
Well, racism in the IFB was just so pervasive that I don't think it would have even, crossed anyone's mind to be offended at that. Like, seriously. And I say that as a solid indictment against the IFB on that. Like, it was that bad.
How did that look?
Oh, the mission itself, you mean?
No, I'm saying like, how did the racism in the IFB look when you were like, when you're saying it's so pervasive?
Well, I mean, we would go to different churches and, it didn't matter if they were in the South or up north or what have you. There was always this feeling that the IFB churches themselves were so separated that they were far away from anything that they considered to be the liberalization that the Southern Baptist Convention, say, was going through. And they were so held to the old paths that, they basically supported, things all the way from J. Frank Norris down. And as you recall, J. Frank Norris was a flaming racist, and
friends
a
with the
Klansman
Klan,
at that.
if not a Klansman himself.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So they saw no problem with it because most of their heroes at some point were affiliated with J. Frank Norris or any of his many, many offshoots. And then, of course, you had people who, especially, considering that, we were missionaries during the Clinton years. And I always noticed that, when certain people are in office, that churches tend to kind of like waver in their patriotism a bit and start to talk about, the government's cracking down on us. I remember that there were a lot of churches where, because I would listen to pastors talk, especially, among my dad and what have you, they would, the subject would start getting on to say, Confederate, this, that, and the other. And after looking over both shoulders, you would hear pastors say things like, well, but it really wasn't about slavery, right? And conversations like that were just so common in the IFB that I grew up in that it, like you said, churches that supported missionaries that had very clearly, racist affiliations and everything. It just, that was never a question for them. I guarantee you, even if the pastors of certain churches didn't personally support, they weren't as racist as, of churches elsewhere, they knew or were friends with people who were, and they followed people who carried on that legacy from the very beginnings of the IFB. And it's a legacy that I don't think has ever been addressed in the IFB period. Like, and even like, say, with Bob Jones University, which isn't, technically IFB proper, but, is very closely affiliated with the Independent Fundamental Baptist movement. Like, if you look at their narrative of how they've dealt with racial issues in the past, it's all very downplayed. It's all talking about like, well, we made some mistakes, but we're growing and everything. I'm like, no, you supported, like you were founded by a rank segregationist, and you kept those policies in place until 2000. And I would argue the undercurrent that kept them in place still exists in that college today. So it's just part of the whole scene, and it's horrible, and it's never really been dealt with head on. And keep in mind too, like, some of the most racist things that I've heard from the pulpit, and I don't dare repeat them, even for historical purposes, but some of the most racist things I heard were from, in fact, missionaries at missions conferences. The way they would talk about the people, especially in underdeveloped nations or previously colonized nations and such, the way they would talk about the people sometimes would just smack of condescension and contempt. And looking back on it, it was played for laughs, like, oh yeah, these people don't even know, da, 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 da. But then looking back on it, like I look back on it with so much shame. I was just like, did these folks even care about the fact that they were going to allegedly help human beings? Did they even see them as human?
Or were they just trying to like pad their own egos and brag to their friends about how good they were at doing missions or
exactly
whatever, I guess.
And when you think about it, it's almost like multi-level marketing. Like the existence of the system was to propagate the system and to say that, oh, well, we have, self-replicating churches, throughout the entire world. And if you could make a comfortable enough living, just perpetuating that and such, like that's a very heady thing, especially if you could be like one of these missionaries that every pastor, if you were able to rise in the, ranks of the IFB and be known and stuff, like it was very prestigious. But the problem is, of course, you have to be, for lack of a better word, a complete to get there.
When you would go to these missions conferences, would there be like a requirement like, okay, I got this many souls saved?
I mean, there was some churches that requested that you send how many people you were winning to the Lord, as they called it. You would have to report how many tracts you handed out, how many people you personally witnessed to. Some churches were more strict and they wanted solid numbers on that. Other churches, you could just basically say, well, we're trying. And Dad always tempered expectations when we would present the work to the church, saying, hey, look, we're talking to cold-hearted people over there who, have lived in secularism for so long. They're not going to be as responsive. They're not running up and down the streets with signs saying, what must I do to be saved? It's going to be slow progress. It was slow enough to be non-existent. But yeah, he would, he would always talk about how many, because we were allowed to put tracks through doors. We were allowed to like put things in mail slots as long as it wasn't, straight up advertising. We would put tracks through doors and stuff like that, and he would report back the numbers of how many we handed out, and he would just kind of keep it quiet as to how much response we heard, which was next to nothing. So it was mostly he focused on, the Bible studies that we were doing with people. There were some folks who, and eventually our meal ticket over there, and what frankly kept us in the country, because we were almost deported by the Belgian government several times, was that he took a position with the American Air Force as a auxiliary chaplain. Essentially to run services there for the military at the small base in Belgium. And that's how we were able to stay in, because the Belgian government saw right through our bullshit. They were like, we don't understand this religion you're part of. It seems weird to us. It seems like this is something that our folks could be doing. You're probably taking away a job, so you don't need to be here. And then the commander of the base that we were at liked Dad, and he was like, well, we're going to make you officially our chaplain so they can't touch you. And that's how we were able to stay over there. So stuff like that, and the Bible studies we had with Americans.
That's so sketchy.
Yeah, it was
unbelievably sketchy.
It was.
No, but like, so you're over here reporting these soul winning numbers, or these non-existent soul winning numbers, and you go back and you see other people reporting numbers that I assume that in other parts of the world, the soul winning numbers are better.
Typically, yeah.
But I guess you guys were reporting actual numbers. You weren't juicing it. If you ever get to the point where you look at these numbers and you say, is anybody actually getting saved on these? Or did you see other people coming back and saying, oh, their numbers are good? Well, our numbers are bad. What are they doing that we're not doing?
I mean, in our case, we just kept emphasizing the fact that we were trying to get a church established, and we would point to things like, oh, we have Bible studies with these people, and hopefully that'll be a church someday. And that was the main thrust of our things. It wasn't so much, soul winning in and of itself, though we did talk about how many tracts we put out. We talked mostly about like trying to get a church that ultimately would be, where the most souls would be saved for years to come. So, Dad was smart in that he tried to make the goal a institutional one rather than a, strictly here's how many people we witnessed to one. Because we were able to do that just by handing out tracts. But, the real result in his, the way he set the standard was, we need to have a church. And we came close a couple of times. The church had maybe 5 people in it, and they were the same people that we had been talking to all along. But, yeah, it was, but it never quite came to fruition.
And those were the same people that he knew back in the 70s.
Pretty much. Yeah. Like, they knew way back then. They kept in touch. They had written letters and called and everything over the years. So when we came over, they were like, sure, we'd love to have a Bible study with you, basically hang out. And sure, we'd love to, meet in this little building and call it a church every Sunday. But there really wasn't anything, that came of it other than we just hung out with Mom and Dad's friends for, a couple of hours every Sunday, and that was it.
I mean, at a certain point, you've got to wonder: are these people just doing it to be nice to you, or do they?
More or less, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I'm sorry, man. You got to wonder about the conversations they were having behind closed doors. They're like, why are they over here? Like, what are they doing?
At the end of the day, nobody in Europe wants to be an American fundamentalist. Like, and I'm speaking broadly, but people in Europe have a completely different mindset. It's a different culture. In the part of Europe we were in, we were trying to make them Americans. The way Dad would present the work to churches was that, in these two countries, there are no good independent fundamental Bible believing churches, so we need to go ahead and establish those. Like, it was all about the churches. Well, the kind of fundamentalism that we have over here is uniquely American. And I mean, it's terrible and is problematic as all hell. But then you try to go over there and, train these people to essentially become little Americans, and it's not going to work. Like, there's a whole bunch of, first of all, you don't even want to do that because you're just going to make people worse. If you make them like, I still stay awake at night sometimes thinking about the things I did when I was in fundamentalism, and the fact that we tried to get people in Europe who were just living their lives and wanted no part of it and everything. The fact that we tried to get them to do the horrible things we were doing still upsets me.
You ask me, you make all these people into Americans. That's an improvement.
Well,
I mean, look, NFL football is popular in the UK now. You're gonna say, hey, do you want Coca-Cola? Do you want?
I mean,
no. McDonald's.
I mean, as terrible as these large corporations are and everything, they are even more benevolent somehow than IFB fundamentalism, and that's a huge indictment against IFB.
Baptize them. You need to get them saved on like a Dallas Cowboys jersey.
Oh my God! In the name of Tom Landry, but yeah. But I will say my biggest regret in the time I spent overseas, and I've said this over and over, is the whole time I lived there, I was taught to view these people who lived in the Netherlands and Belgium as a project and not as people. And that was a huge missed opportunity because I didn't appreciate their culture. I didn't appreciate the day-to-day life. I didn't appreciate their perspective on anything. I was taught that we had come over there to teach these people a better way to do life, teach these people, how to be real Christians, aside from what they had grown up with. And it was just so... I missed out on learning so much about how the world worked and how different people have different perspectives and such, that is one of my biggest regrets. The fact that we went over there and had this huge opportunity to learn and to be among, folks who didn't grow up like us, who didn't share our perspective and stuff, and just completely discount it and never learn a thing from it. That to me is just one of the biggest regrets I have of my life.
Well, on that sorry note, sadly, I think it's time for us to end this episode. Chad, thanks so much for coming on. Do you want to tell the fine people where they can find you, where they can find your social media, where they can go to your Not Church?
Certainly. All over the internet, if you find Archradish, that's Chad Harris mixed up, it's probably going to be me. You can find me on TikTok primarily. I'm also on Instagram. And if you haven't seen Shiny Happy People yet, I encourage you to go do so.
Thanks so much for coming on. You have a great day.
Thanks for having me. Take care.